I wanted to show you a picture this morning. And if you have never seen this picture, this is a picture of Oroville Dam 3 years ago. If you remember the story behind this picture, you will know that we had quite a snowfall up in the mountains. And then there was a lot of rain in February that started to wash all that snow away all of a sudden into our lakes and reservoirs. Oroville Dam is the largest dam, or the tallest dam in the United States, standing over 700 feet tall. But there was a design flaw with the Oroville Dam, and that was that its spillway was not meant to receive the amount of water that was spilling out of the lake all of a sudden. And so what happened was that their spillway started to deteriorate, and yet they were still trying to release water, and so they opened up their emergency floodgates, which can be found on the left of your picture there, and those emergency floodgates started to flood as well. Now, being a resident up in that area at the time in Orland, the people were getting concerned about the vulnerability of whether or not this dam was going to stand, and there was a report that it was about ready to collapse, and therefore the emergency people decided that they needed to evacuate the whole town of Oroville and surrounding areas that would have been the floodplain. Because if that part of the dam on the left would have collapsed, there would have been a wall of water about 20 feet high that would have gone through the town of Oroville, which is right below the dam. And so it was if you will, a humanitarian crisis of which that area had never known. There were over 100,000 people in that general area that were displaced. And it was a very tense time, and I remember being called in the middle of the night to go into Chico, which was one of the receiving centers, and try to help because there were so many people coming in to those centers that they needed all hands on deck. Well, it just so happened that after this disaster, they finally were able to get enough water out of the lake and limit the flow of water into the lake, that they averted a major crisis. And in essence, what they did was they filled the breach, or they temporarily repaired the dam so that on another day and another time they could make more permanent repairs. This idea of repair is something that is very appropriate for today. Because in the book of Corinthians, in the second letter of Corinthians, Paul talks about how we are to repair the world and be a new creation, being reconciled to one another and being reconciled to God. We are, in essence, repairing, according to Paul, repairing the breach of humanity. Now, if you know anything about Paul, this was of a great concern, because Paul was a preacher that was a very itinerant preacher. After Paul's conversion on the road to Damascus, Paul was energized and enabled to go out through the ancient world and to spread the gospel of Jesus Christ. But like any preacher along that road and in the places that Paul went to, it was not always smooth going. It seems that if you read about the life and the ministry of Paul, there was always something that was happening. Whether it be the fact that should only the early converts be Jews, or could they be Gentiles? And then they got into things like, well, if they're Gentiles, then should they follow Jewish law in order to be Christians? And then there was this situation in the Corinthian church. And Paul writes two different letters to the Corinthians. So you knew there was something, either that he had a heart for the Corinthians, or there was something messed up with the Corinthian church. And if you study that, you will see that it was kind of a combination of both. But in 2 Corinthians, Paul is writing to the Corinthians because the church is really irritated with him. Now, being a pastor here at this church and in other churches, I can kind of resonate with Paul. Because as a pastor, you're always doing something that's going to make somebody mad, either in the church or the community. Comes with the territory of being a pastor. And Paul's offense was that the Corinthians expected that he was going to go someplace else and do the work of evangelism in Macedonia and then come to Corinth, but instead Paul felt that there were so many things going on in the church that he needed to address that he came to Corinth first. And instead of the people wanting and desiring Paul's presence, they were angry at him, of all things, for being in Corinth instead of being out evangelizing among the Macedonians. And so that is a sense of what is behind the letter in 2 Corinthians. But what is really behind what Paul is talking about in our passage today is that throughout Paul's ministry, Paul, number one, wanted all of us to be reconciled to the love of Christ and to the life-saving grace that Jesus has for all of us. But Paul also lived something else in his life. Being the good Hebrew that he was, he lived the idea of tikkun olam, which basically means to repair the breach or to repair the world. And so Paul, wherever he went, whatever he did, that's what his ministry was about, was to repair the world wherever that might be. Ephesus, Corinth, Macedonia, to name a few places, to repair and to bring people in relationship with Jesus, who was the one that would truly repair the breaches in our world. It's a picture of Corinth, present day, not during Paul's time. Just wanted to show you that. As I stand before you and as I stand as your pastor, I feel that same weight that Paul must have felt with his people about repairing the world. Just this morning, as I was sitting in my office, I got a call from a gentleman. Don't know him from Adam, but I get these calls a lot. And these calls start out something like this. They explain their life issue to me, whether that be they're homeless, whether that be they're down on their luck. But the reality is that they are in need. And this gentleman was no different. He explained his issue. He explained that he was a hard-working person, but that he had fallen on hard times. He had a debilitating disease, and he was asking me for assistance. And that's a whole nother story. But as I realize that person, and as I realize so many people in this world, and as I look out into the world, I feel a sense of weight on what is happening in our world. I travel daily between the church and Martinez, between my home and Martinez and the church. And it seems that every day I travel, I see more and more homeless people out on the streets or out in some encampment someplace. As I listen to the news, I hear about people struggling in our area and also people struggling around our country with issues like health care and being just on that verge of falling into a sense of despair and homelessness. And because of that, I feel a weight upon my shoulders, and I think that we should all feel that weight, because it's not only about me, but it's about all of us. Because we see suffering in our midst, and sometimes we feel like we're helpless to do anything. And perhaps we are. But I do know this, and that is that each day I wake up with hope. I wrote a newsletter article for our April newsletter, and one of the things I mentioned in that newsletter is that I am not a glass half empty sort of guy. I am always a glass half full sort of guy, meaning that I always and will ever have a sense of optimism about the world in which I live. And yet, even in the midst of that, and even in the midst of realizing that there are so many problems facing us, I do believe that it is the collective will of people like us and people around this country that we want to be about tikkun olam, repairing the world. And of course, we do that in a variety of ways. We place people in leadership that have a vision for our world. We also do it in our midst through such things as serving in some capacities that this church has to offer, like things like feeding, taking meals to the homeless shelter, and also doing our ministry of Shelter Inc. and also the ministry that we just completed a few weeks ago with Winter Nights. Those are practical ways that we are helping to repair the world, to be about tikkun olam. We do that in a variety of ways. And I wanted to leave you with one last thing, because I think that this epitomizes a way that we can all be about helping the world. You have in your bulletin a flyer for UMCOR Sunday. And if you do not know what UMCOR is, it is not a word. It is an acronym for United Methodist Committee on Relief. Us Methodists are always good at acronyms, though. But UMCOR is an organization that when we have a disaster like what we had with the Paradise Fire, or what we are having now with some of the humanitarian crises around the world, that UMCOR is there supporting either by personnel or by funding. And so I wanted to leave you with one last story of a way in which we support and alleviate and perhaps even repair the world and are about to come along in another place in the world. This is a picture of Hannah. She was 9 years old when ISIS came. And ISIS, of course, is the radical Islamic group that took over part of Iraq. They came in the middle of the night, the sounds of war startling the family of 14 awake. Amid gunfire and circling planes overhead, Hannah's family fled from their home in their father's car, passing scenes of death in a place that had just hours before held their lives. A perilous 9-day journey lay ahead for the family. They ran out of food and water. They witnessed just heinous crimes conducted by ISIS, the Islamic State in Iraq and Syria. Their lifeline broke down eventually. And for protection, they began traveling on foot at night under the cover of darkness, standing and starving and exhausted. And they were spotted by strangers on the roadside and brought to the Konki refugee camp in Dohuk, Iraq. Hannah still hoped that her time away from home would be brief and temporary. She looked forward to going back to school. She is now 13 years old and still has not returned home or to school. But because of this humanitarian crisis and because of this crisis of immense human migration, your United Methodist Committee on Relief started a program. And it was a program called Tutapona. And what it is it's a program in which young women like Hannah, receive trauma rehabilitation. And people like Hannah and young people that are in the program not only receive rehabilitation, but they're able to go back to school and to maintain some semblance of life. And without donations like ours from the United Methodist Church and donations from you who are members of the Walnut Creek United Methodist Church, we could not support this ministry of the United Methodist Committee on Relief. It is just one small way that we are about to come olam, repairing the world. But it is a significant way because we are affecting people's lives. And so your donation today to UMCOR, the United Methodist Committee on Relief, is a significant way in which we repair that breach. And I hope you realize that there are other ways that you do that by the ministries that we are about in this church, and about the ways that you lead your life, because your life is a way in which people come to know the life-giving presence of Jesus Christ in their lives. After church today, you will be asked to take a quilt square, such as the one that I have, with a piece of masking tape on it, because the makers of these quilt squares did not want me to forget to tell you this. But this is a reminder for you as you go home to put this someplace prominent, to put this in the place where you've put your hearts and your stones and all those things that you have received as take-home things. Because these reminders are reminders of what we are about. And we're not just about coming to church on Sunday, but we're about changing lives. And we're about tikkun olam, repairing the world. And so go forward and do the same. In Jesus' name, amen.